Welcome to the Farmanco presentation about frosted crops. The frost has been very widespread and devastating for many, and warm weather in the last few days has really shown up the damage that has occurred. Having travelled around and spoken to many people, there's large degrees of damage, but the damage is widespread and many of you are wondering what to do about it. And I've put together this presentation hopefully which will cover off on all the things that you should think about. A lot about mental health these days, but I think it's probably very important to reiterate the importance of it. I'm seeing a lot of people that are deeply affected by the frost that has occurred, and that will have an impact on the decisions that you make from here on in. It's really important, if you're not travelling well, to try and recognise it, talk to family, friends and get advice. But unless you deal with this first, then the frost situation and how you deal with that will be impacted. So this is the number one priority and the most important thing for your business. I've visited a number of you and people are reacting very differently to the damage they're finding on the farm. Some people are driving all over the farm and making numerous assessments and probably working themselves up into a mental state that isn't the best for them. I've spoken to others of you that have said, well, what will be will be. The weather's good for fishing, isn't it? I think I might go and do that. I guess it's easy for me to suggest that this is a way you should try and be, and it's harder to act out, especially if you've been impacted. But the people that are doing this and thinking this way are putting themselves in the best position to make the right decisions on their farm when the time comes. The common reaction to have after an event like the one we've just had is to want to do something, and you just need to make sure that if you go and act, that it is in the best interest for the business and the farm. It's easy to overreact, overinvest, probably put good money after bad and cost the business. So it's just human nature, but you need to take a stock of yourself and think of all the things you need to think of and think them through and then make logical decisions. Sometimes having no action is the best action, and we'll talk about that in a moment. A lot of people are asking me what they can do. I guess the one thing you can do is think about your market commitments with your grain marketer or contracts. And if you've got any sense that you may not be able to deliver to these, at least have a conversation with your grain marketer and get this covered off on. Price variation hasn't been great to date, although the wheat price is going up, and if this keeps going up, you could well be out of the money. So that conversation is probably the best thing you can do of anything in terms of a decision on the farm. I made the other statement on this slide. It's a very broad one. Don't make hay. And I've said this just to shock you into really thinking this through, and I'll go through this in detail in the next few slides. The thing about the hay equation is comparing what you might get with hay in terms of the yield, the price, and the costs of making it compared to what you might get with the grain that may or may not still be there in the paddock, and the costs that you might have. Thing is, with the current grain, you're going to have to chop it one way or another, be it hay, be it choppers, or harvesting the grain. But lining the two up together will give you an informed decision, and I'll go through this in some detail. So if you are going to make hay, you need to have a view of the yield of the hay and the potential yield of the grain that you might be getting if you don't make the hay, because that's how we'll do the economic calculation. It's really hard actually to do a grain yield calculation at the moment. There are, even in the 100% looking wiped out crops, some heads in the lower part of the canopy that could still form viable grain, and reshooting is still possible. The difficulty, as many people are pointing out, is a very low degree of subsoil moisture, and therefore the uncertainty as to whether those secondary tillers and smaller heads will have the opportunity to fill the grain. is really tricky. The one thing about frost evaluation and grain yield experience shows that when you first estimate it, you might assume a certain yield. When you go to harvest it, I think in general you end up with more grain than you estimated you would have. However, this year is dry and uncertain, but as a general rule of thumb, you tend to overreact with the damage that you think you've had, and the harvester header gives you more grain than you thought. The other major consideration with all of this is what is wheat and hay, and I'll talk about wheat and hay mainly in this presentation, but it applies to the other crops as well. What is my hay worth? I've spent a reasonable amount of time ringing around the export hay producers to establish a price, but ultimately I've established that if you can find a local market in Esperance, then this is certainly the way to go. And I guess there are opportunities there, but you'd want to establish them fairly soon. The price probably won't be any better, but the hay freight is a killer. So if you can sell locally, that changes the economics of the comparison quite markedly. So looking for a local buyer is important. If you go to the export side of things, then there is a considerable freight component, and I'll give you some details about that. I've phoned several hay buyers just to establish what the potential price might be. I think the consensus is around $150 tonne landed to depot, be it Brookton, York, Narrogin. There could well be an upside. It could be up to $200, but there's no promises there. I think in summary, the local market will be satisfied by the local frost in the central wheat belt. There are potential opportunities into export, being Korea and Taiwan, also potentially the Middle East. They're still talking $150 to $200 a tonne. There is some uncertainty about the potential total tonnage that they'll be able to receive, and if the markets fill, then the price will drop. However, this is, I guess, the figure that we should be looking for. The other thing that they have expressed concern about from Esperance Hay producing croppers that are producing hay, we have no experience in it. They're worried about the quality of the hay, the chemical, especially Lontril, and other aspects of the hay, including the quality. If we get any weather on the windrows prior to baling, that will have an impact and make the export market significantly worse. So there's a few uncertainties here, but $150 a tonne seems like a reasonable price to work with. The key aspect to all of this is to do some research, not only on price, but also the costs of making the hay. I'll talk about how to calculate yield in a moment, and for demonstration purposes, I've got some actual costs I've done with a client just to help you with your own calculations if you're thinking this way. $50 mower conditioner. Raking wasn't a cost, but there was a fuel component of the mowing. Baling was $33 a tonne, some stacking and handling, and the freight is the scary one. In this case, we used $90 a tonne, and we've done this by just going grain freight cost to those hay export depots times 1.5, as hay is less dense than grain, and that's probably the easiest way of working it out, and according to the hay buyers, reasonably accurate. So the cost per hectare for a 5-tonne wheat crop with the costs I've used in this example are approaching $700, which is not a small investment. How much hay will I get? It's a good question, and there is a large degree of uncertainty, but I'll show you a rough way of figuring it, just depending on the crop type. The way we work out hay biomass is by using a ratio called harvest index. And the harvest index ratio is basically the grain yield divided by the total biomass, which includes that of the grain. So I'll move to the next slide. you talk to most of the hay people, a reasonable harvest index for most crops would be about 50%. This means you get 50% of the total crop biomass would be grain. So if you've got think you're getting a 3 tonne crop, your total biomass would be approximately 6 tonnes. Now there's variation around this and every crop is different. If you get a leafier crop with lower grain yield, then the biomass will be higher than this ratio, the grain yield. For the easiest estimate, I have been using 50% harvest index and subtracting a tonne. So therefore, if you think you've got a 3 tonne grain crop, 50% means you're going to get 6 tonnes of total hay, depending on how high you cut. Take off a tonne for a safety margin, so 5 tonnes of hay, maybe more or less than this. So that gives you the background to most of the numbers that we can use in a comparison to look at the economics of cutting a hay crop, a frosted crop for hay. Now in the example on the blue side of this table, you can see that I've assumed a 5 tonne hay crop. I've used the same cost that I showed you before in the breakdown of making hay, and I've assumed $150 a tonne for that hay. That, after doing that whole exercise and sending off the hay to a buyer in the wheat belt, I've made a gross margin of $53. That's not particularly attractive and compares to a grain yield of 0.35 tonnes per hectare. Admittedly, I've got $300 on that wheat, and frosted wheat could well be worth less, but I guess it's just by way of example. The thing that strikes me with this is you're putting a lot of money up front, you're taking a reasonable risk. If you get a quality hit or you don't get the price that you thought you would, you could well be out of the money with this exercise. I don't want to be negative Nancy, and I'm not saying don't cut hay, and I did make that broad statement right at the beginning, but I'm saying really think this through. I think the key to it is to talk to the potential buyers and work out what you are confident the price will be, or get as confident as you can be. I've just, for the sake of it, just only changed the price per hay in the example I used in the previous slide from $150 to $200. You can see instantly that you're making $303 by that exercise. You've still made a considerable investment up front. And it doesn't come without risk, but in this example you're $300 better off than having no grain. I guess the other way to look at it is that would be equivalent to harvesting about 1.3 tonnes of grain at $300. So the price of the hay has a big influence on the relative economics of producing the hay. Once again, if the freight component is reduced, this example gets significantly better, especially if you sell locally. Now, it's important to note that even though I've shown quite a few economics, I've paid no attention to the cost of the nutrients that would leave your farm with the hay. In the example I've used so far, I've been talking about 5 tonnes of hay, and with 5 tonnes of hay, you are exporting approximately $222 per hectare of nutrients. The thing to remember here is if you're on heavy soil in the Mallee, then potash is probably not an economic concern to you. So this could be taken out of this value. So it might be reduced to $150. But either way, it's a significant amount of nutrients that are leaving the farm and are coming at a genuine cost to you. Lastly, I just want to be even-handed about the information I'm providing and show you the example of hay sold locally with the freight cost down to $15. Makes a significant difference to the gross margin. So 5 tonne hay crop with a $15 freight cost, so sold locally at $150 means a gross margin of $428. So if you can ring somebody that has livestock, establish a price and the fact that they will buy it from you, then this whole equation changes. I guess there's limited opportunities. Similarly, for $200 a tonne, the gross margin ends up at $678. I've just realised that my head is over some of the figures I've been talking about, but you'll need to, I guess, trust me that the gross margin below my head for the $200 a tonne hay crop is $678. So in summary, there's a lot to think about here, but look after yourself first. And I'm not saying that lightly. Just do that. And if it's doing your head in, talk to friends or get some help or advice. As I've said, I guess the only thing you should be doing from my point of view is talking to your grain market about your position and your contract obligations. So do that. Lastly, if you're going to do hay, really do your research. Think of the numbers I've shown you. You can plug them into that spreadsheet and go for your life. You need to be aware of the risks and the potential cost to you. Don't just go and cut hay thinking that you're doing a good thing because you've been frosted. Really make sure you've thought that through before you do it. So I'm sorry about the frost. It's been quite devastating for many of you. Look after yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you during the next few weeks.